Our fourth panelist will be Mr. Timo Biank, who is a sociologist working with the German Agency for International Cooperation, GIZ. He is a sociologist, cultural anthropologist, economist, and he has worked with GIZ in several positions, amongst others in Mauritania, Ukraine, and Germany. He's a team leader of the GIZ sector program on religion and development, which is advising the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development in the implementation of their 2016 strategy, Religious Communities as Partners for Development Cooperation. And Timo Biank will be representing also the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development on this panel. Last but not least, we have with us Professor Dr. Nayla Tabbara, who is the chairperson and founding member of Adyan, Foundation for Diversity, Solidarity and Human Dignity. She is also co-president of Religions for Peace and member of the executive committee of its World Council. She is professor in religious and Islamic studies at Saint Joseph University in Beirut. As a Muslim woman theologian, she has published widely in Islamic theology and Islamic feminism, education, and interreligious dialogue. I want to highlight one publication, A Woman's Interpretation of Islam, published in 2018. It's great to have you with us. Welcome to the panelists. It's really a privilege to be hosting this panel with you. Now, I would like to start with a question to Monsignor Professor Dr. Obiora Ike. And my question is, why do we need to talk about religion and development? How do you see the relation of religion to the Agenda 2030?
Thank you very much, Philip, for this question and for the great preparation all of you have done. Thank you, Dietrich, for a marathon presentation, actually a comprehensive depth of the work which we are doing. I mean, Dietrich, you are a special resource person for the globe. I want to appreciate you. And I want to appreciate all those together with me on this panel. Why we need religion, why we need development. And the question, Philip, you have posed is very clear. First of all, anything about faith, belief is domained in an area, and issues of religion are linked with issues of faith, belief in something. And it is this belief that religion, let me say, condones in terms of its ingredient, its impact on the social planes. So start from there. So religion is a vehicle for faith transformation. Do we need it? Do we need faith? The question is not do we need, it is part of human being. A human being believes in something. So it is just like a human being eats food, drinks water, believes in tomorrow, awaits, expects. Faith is about expectation. The second one is to say that even to development also, the only problem we see is the limitation of development. We must develop, yes, but in what direction? Is it just material development, social, economic, political, human, spiritual, and so on? As long as we limit development to quantitative, and Dietrich mentioned it, we limit the human quality. So development is integral, complete. Taking both, therefore, I would like to say that we need development, we need religion, because we want to progress humanity. And to progress humanity means to progress the overall good of that which makes human beings who they are, different from other beings. And it is necessary. Therefore, issues of justice, issues of equity, issues of transparency, issues of ethics, issues of the common good, issues of human dignity and of rights become part of this agenda, without which you will be talking only in, let me say, limited tones. Finally, taking note of the time available, finally, it is important to state, and I'm grateful to Dietrich having mentioned it also, we have had models of development of religion always coming from one part of the globe, let me say from the Eurocentric dimension. And the larger human community spread among the Hindus, the Muslims, the African traditional religions, and so on, their voices are often not even considered. Also because we have a dominant, let me say, presentation and understanding of the terminologies we use. Take, for example, just this week, the bishops of Ghana, Catholic bishops, have decided to plant 1 billion trees in the whole country. Every Christian is part of it. It's not news in Europe. But this is already eco-theology, planting trees led by the church, because it is part of make the creation new. But when we hear only the things happening in Europe and their point of view, it limits the discussion. That's why, Philip, this galaxy of participants from South Africa, Asia, and so on, Beirut, adds value to the work you are doing. I want to say that religion and development are not just needed, they are part of that which we must continue to integrate. But religion does not go alone, it goes with ethics, because ethics is the practice, it is the value, it is the dimension of doing good versus doing the wrong things. I want to thank you, and I hope that when you establish the center in Berlin, which already is established elsewhere, like in Zambia and in Zimbabwe, this year already, the Center for Religion and Development has been established. So let's have a coalition for good.
Thank you, Obiora. And I would like to move on to Nadine Bowers de Toit with the question, to what extent would you say are the SDGs a relevant frame of reference for local actors' religious work in the development sphere?
Thank you, Philip, and good morning, everybody from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you also again to Dietrich for a very comprehensive and I think very thought-provoking paper. So I hope we'll be able to get that afterwards and share it with students and colleagues. So to what extent do I think SDGs are a relevant frame of reference for local religious actors? So firstly, I think to acknowledge SDGs are worthy goals in and of themselves. No one can dispute the fact that ending poverty, all the goals are not worthy, as were the MDGs before them. And of course, it can be used as a kind of monitoring framework in some way. My hermeneutic of suspicion, a notion very much influenced by a theology of liberation, however, for local faith actors, is that the problem with such overarching goals is that they can drown out local needs and local initiatives. And we see this in the way that donors align themselves to the SDGs. And then, as we all too often know, FPOs will tailor their programs sometimes and their outcomes to fit that agenda in order to get the funding. And especially in COVID times, with the narrowing of donor funding internationally, this becomes a more and more appealing option to actors on the ground. And it's also appealing for funding agencies who can align themselves with the globally recognized brands, such as the UN. And we know the problems, the results are often problematic. And as a FPO board member, I've seen this actually happen in real life. So essentially, such frameworks are top-down and don't always take account of bottom-up or decolonial ways of doing development. So my question with the SDGs, as much as I can appreciate them, is, and maybe Professor Ike is saying something similar, isn't it another neo-colonial way of doing development? Local faith actors and communities already have and are responding to local development issues in often creative ways that don't look like an SDG or even fit maybe into an evaluation framework properly. But then do we now discount this as not being development? Are many religious actors even aware of the SDGs, local religious actors at grassroots? Or do they even regard them as important? So in my own research, and of course it's in a limited context of South Africa, but I've not once heard a clergy person or a faith non-profit sector person mention the SDGs in terms of their motivation. Most of their motivation is faith-rooted or theologically rooted and contextually driven by issues in their local communities. So I also worry if we equate the SDGs to development, which of course in itself is a notion that could be interrogated, and it has been in this particular conference. So that's great to hear some of that happening as well. I think we really just, what I'm saying is we run the risk of not taking account of what's really going on at grassroots. And as helpful as SDGs are in some ways, they, as a lens, if you will, it could become a blind spot to creative and contextual grassroots engagement. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine. And I think this relates very well also to the work that you've been doing, Professor Narayanaswamy. And we spoke in the preparation of this panel discussion. We spoke about the challenge of being persons with difficult names. Me with the German umlaut in the surname. My question to you would be, what is the added value even? I mean, connecting to what Obiora and Nadine have said, what is the added value even of having a global framework such as the SDGs? And, you know, what might more appropriate frameworks look like?
Yeah. Firstly, hopefully you can hear me. So first to say thank you. First to say thank you so much for the invitation. It's such a privilege to be in this space with all of you. The fact that anybody might want to listen to what I'm saying feels a little bit overwhelming. So it's lovely to have you all. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the lovely introductory presentation. Dietrich, there's really so much to think about, which hopefully we can also get into a discussion as well. And thank you, Philip, as well for the question. Certainly for me, I come at the question of the relationship between religion and development, not as somebody who has any specialist knowledge on theology at all. So of course, it's really lovely to listen to all of you, and I'm listening and I'm learning and enjoying that very much. For me, I'm very interested in the ways then in which religion actually doesn't seem to feature in how we think about the knowledge that drives development. So that's the lens that I would bring into this space. My own research has been sort of thinking about knowledge and development, whose knowledge counts, and overlaps really quite well with some of the things that both Professor du Toit and Professor Ike that you've talked about in terms of the tendency for that Eurocentric focus to maybe drown out other ways of thinking about the world. And I think religion gets a little bit lost in that dialogue as well. But to think about the question, Philip, that you've asked, which I think is a really important one, follows on well in our discussion so far. In terms of the SDGs themselves, and I do say this all the time, and some people I think in this space will have heard me say this before, but I do think we mustn't underestimate what a huge achievement it is for over 190 countries to come together and agree on anything. Right? So I think we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. That's huge. And I do think there are things that are valuable to save and to reflect on in terms of the sort of world that the SDG envisions for us collectively. I think there's something in there that we mustn't, that we shouldn't risk losing. But in particular, it offers a vision and that we can be part of that helps us to drive collective action. So the power of a framework, and again, Professor du Toit, you already said this, and I think I would definitely agree, is that we mustn't underestimate the power of a framework to then drive collective action, right? If we don't have anything we're working towards, it's difficult for us to come together. So the SDGs offers us a focus. So for me, the challenge in the context of today's discussion is that religion and spirituality are not really directly discussed in the SDGs. That's the first thing I would say. And so for me, then, we can approach the question of the relationship of religion to development and the SDGs by thinking about how we know the world, which highlights key challenges for how religion and the SDGs interact. So here I'll make a couple of very quick points. So the first is that the lens through which the SDGs are formulated is one of science. And this is conceptualized as existing entirely separately from spirituality. Now, the idea that religion and spirituality effectively work either separately or, in the worst case scenario, even against the evidence-based and target-focused SDG agenda is a challenge for the types of dialogues and coalitions that Dietrich, you suggested are crucial for moving forward, which, by the way, I agree. I agree that those coalitions are really crucial, but I think that's a key challenge, which is that I do see that sort of religious thinking and teaching is sort of situated oppositionally to the sort of science and evidence-based agenda. How we sort of overcome that to create those partnerships, I think, is a key challenge. There are also challenges in the ways in which SDG goals or targets articulate a very fixed idea of what a good life looks like, which again goes back to what both you, Professor Dutroux and Professor Ike, you were talking about, and even what development is, because I struggle with we get students come in and say, well, give me a definition of development. Actually, I can't do that. There is no definition of development. And I would not be doing my job if I tried to give you one. But as Professor Ike says, we need to move in particular beyond what you called the quantitative measures, which I appreciate. I think that was really a really good idea. And also beyond the material measures. So if we had then a spiritual take on what a good life looks like, is that potentially an entry point for a dialogue between religion and what we think of as development, whatever that is? But in that articulation of in the SDG articulation of what a good life looks like, the knowledge, resources, and relationships that are needed for the kind of life that people might seek that help us to achieve the SDGs, I would argue that there's no real insight in that space about how religion could or should be a part of that. And I think that's a real problem. I think that's a real gap. So a dialogue between development, the SDGs, and religion, for me, must start where people are. What kind of life do people want? What is the role of spirituality in that? And for me, particularly, I'm interested in uncovering and thinking about whose voices are not being heard. What are the silences that the SDGs highlight? Who or what is being excluded in the formulation of the SDGs? So I'll end on this point, which is that in terms of thinking about how we know the world, the ways in which we're allowed to know the world, that sort of Eurocentricity that we've already sort of discussed, I feel that we need a more inclusive dialogue. That is what we would, I guess, call pluriversal. And here I'm also interested in the religious and spiritual traditions, ideas and expressions that fall outside of the tendency to focus primarily on the Abrahamic faiths, with a real emphasis on Christianity and to a little bit of a lesser extent Islam. But there tends to be sort of the focus on these two big religions, which isn't to say that they don't have really important things to tell us. That's not my intent. But I do wonder what we're missing and how we have a dialogue about the diversity of faiths and spiritual traditions that might also help us to think much more pluriversally and much more dynamically about what sustainable development means. What does it look like? What are we collectively trying to achieve? And that is where I think that dialogue has to go. I'll stop there, but I really look forward to listening then to everybody else and to engaging in this conversation with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Lata. And we now move to Mr. Timo Biank of the German Agency for International Cooperation. I would like to ask you, moving away a little bit from the discussion on the SDGs, I would like to ask you, since German development policy has engaged with religion and development for several years now, first of all, what are the key lessons learned? And has religion been mainstreamed in development?
Thank you, Philip, for your questions. Thank you for having me on the panel with so many distinguished speakers with a huge list of publication and a huge knowledge on the panel, so it's a special honor for me speaking here also to you as not being an academic with a huge list of publication. Coming back to your question, I will start that it's not surprisingly for somebody who's coming from the development sphere, working for the German Development Corporation, to say that the 2030 agenda has proven to be the accepted and unifying set of global goals for common action and to forging partnerships with government, religions, faith-based organizations, civil society, business, and academia. However, the shared responsibility of all stakeholders as a key implementation principle for the achievement of the agenda remains demanding. Perhaps also because the shared responsibility of the formulation of the agenda was not like it should be, like other panelists already mentioned. So more engagement is much needed. More than 5 years after the agenda was launched, many SDGs remain off track. You all know this also due to the impact of the pandemic situation we are all living in. Millions of people are systematically left behind. Mr. Dietrich Werner mentioned the time to reach the moon. So what are our key lessons learned within the sector program Religion and Development? We are now working over the past 6 years with religious actors in German Development Corporation, supporting our ministry. And I think we have collected quite some insights, and I would like to present now 5 key lessons learned. Number 1, the volume, depth, and quality of research in Germany, in the global north, in the global south, has tremendously increased, and the exchange about the findings has become a key feature in international academic research. I hope the other panelists share this insight as well, and the fact that we are sitting today together here is also a small sign. The cooperation, secondly, this cooperation and engagement with leaders and practicing actors from various religious and faith belief traditions as strong pillars of civil society on the one hand, and governmental development agency and authorities on the other hand to pursue common development goals has been enhanced and strengthened during the past 6 years. This is, in my personal observation, in particular true for the organized establishment, or like Dietrich Werner pointed out, beyond the mainline spectrum, it's getting more difficult. So the reach out to the global south and not hierarchic organized FBOs remains still a challenge in our work. Third key lesson learned, a precondition for this kind of collaborative or participatory approach is the building of mutual trust through joint identification of common denominators and appropriate forms of planning and programming. This sounds a bit boring, but is in our planning world of development cooperation, you cannot underestimate this point. This is especially true for smaller faith-based organizations who lack perhaps also the capacity which is needed for writing good project proposals, who are accountable to the money they spend, and so on. Fourth observation, or fourth key lessons learned, a lot more needs to be done to overcome resistance towards engaging with religion, especially in fragile contexts and situations of conflict and unrest, where religiously motivated tensions persist. And my last key message, or what we learned, is that religious literacy remains a deficit area, also among us, the development practitioners, coming mostly from the secular north, working in countries of the global south or east or west or wherever. and also among policymakers and activists. So there's still a lack of formation, education, capacity development for staff within people working in development cooperation. Good examples exist, like strategic learning exchanges, staff training courses, or what we have experienced within the multi-stakeholder partnership, in different multi-stakeholder partnerships like PART, but there's a long way to go. So the mainstreaming is not over. And if you look to gender mainstreaming, what we are doing for 30 years in development cooperation or 40 years, it's a long struggle, and we are anchoring it now in development cooperation, but it's not at all mainstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Timo, and thank you also for mentioning the Partnership on Religion and Sustainable Development as one of the global forums for international for engagement between state actors, religious actors, NGOs on questions of religion and development. Moving to Professor Nayla Tabbara, I was very, very interested in our preliminary discussion that you mentioned the issue of religious social responsibility, which points at the, at the kind of commitment expected also from religious actors in their societies. And I would like to invite you to share a little bit on what this entails. Also, what is the responsibility, the social responsibility of religious actors? And if I may connect this to the sustainable development goals and to sustainable development, what are the implications for the SDGs, of the SDGs on religious communities? So what really are the, what can religious communities not only contribute to the SDGs, but to what extent are they also an object of the SDGs?
Thank you very much, Philip. Before going and answering your question on religious social responsibility and building up on what some of my co-panelists were saying, I just want to remind that when we are speaking about religion, we're speaking about, different also interpretations and of religion, and therefore different translation of those interpretation into reality. Religion can be a force for peace, a force for liberation, for justice and common good, but we know also that religion can and is a lot of time force for oppression and for injustice, especially if it's working in conjunction with dynamics of power and politics. So definitely it is very important to be working and the bridging between and cooperate and building this cooperation between international actors and bodies and faith-based actors, and but also not taking religious institutions and religious actors at faith-based values. I mean, we should also have some criteria here about which organizations we work with and how. Religious social responsibility is one of the ways we found in Adyan, which is our organization that we have founded in Lebanon, which is co-founded by Muslim and Christian co-founders, and that works for diversity, solidarity, and human dignity. Religious social responsibility was the way we found to be able to gather the different religious actors together on values of public life together. Again, here, when we speak about values, also there are two types of values. There are values that can sometimes, that are more personal values, or that are sometimes used by religious authorities for actually oppression or for entering into the conscience of people or into their private lives. Whereas there are values of public life. And this is where, this is how we framed religious social responsibility, saying that as religions, when we speak about certain values such as justice, such as human dignity, such as reconciliation, such as responsibility, those values are values of public life. And those values, they are not only for our co-religionists, they are not only for our community or our sect, but these are values that we hold for everyone and that we need to apply with everyone, be they religious or non-religious, from our religion or from another religion. And those would be values that where all would meet. So for the past several years, what we've been doing in collaboration, in partnership with Dan Mission, actually, and funded by Dan Mission, working for integrating these values of public life in religious education and religious discourse, be it in schools now for Christians and Muslims, be it in education of imams and women preachers. So integrating this in public life, in values of public life, in the discourse, in the understanding of the role of what religion is. So, and at the same time, training religious leaders and faith-based organizations in applying this. So we know, and also from the same happens in Religions for Peace, we know that religious organizations are a very big force to help people on the ground, but they rarely work together. So encouraging them to work together in an interreligious way for development. This is also a second translation of religious social responsibility, and to promote what we also call spiritual solidarity, which is cross-communal solidarity. Professor Werner was talking about freedom of religion or belief before. So generally, we see people from one faith defending the right of people of their own faith in other countries. So what we try to promote, whether in Adyan or Religions for Peace, is cross-communal and solidarity, where we are defending together the rights of others, be they of other religions or be they non-religious. And we can talk about, for example, apostasy laws, blasphemy laws, and all the problems that are ensuing from those laws, and what we can work together in changing them. So these are some of the answers to your question, and maybe I will leave the rest for later, so that I don't take a lot of time.
Thank you, Nayla. Allow me to stay with you for just one more minute. You mentioned the issue of freedom of religion and belief, and I think this also relates in a way to the point made by Dietrich earlier about the shrinking space for civil society, shrinking space for religious actors. So what you say, do we need to include this more explicitly in a possible post-2030 development agenda, religious freedom? Freedom of religion and belief.
Very important. And yes, freedom of religion and belief, and not only religious freedom, because it includes non-believers, but it includes also people from within a religion that have different interpretations. And those, a lot of time, these are people that are put in jail because of their different interpretation. And definitely we need to promote this. This needs to be added. So bridging between what SDGs do and what religious communities do, this is very important. We're working on such cooperation, but also including in SDGs post-2030 that is very important, and also religion and SDG 5. Women and there is feminists from different religions who are working from within, but we have a lot. We have laws to change. We have to mainstream women as religious leaders, and this is still very, very, very minimal. And we have to mainstream also women as theologians, and not only theologians about feminist issues, but theologians in general. So we need to work on those. Those are my two recommendations to add to the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Nayla. And coming back to our first speaker, Obiora, freedom of religion and belief, is that something we should include in a possible post-SDG agenda?
Good question. Next question.
And of course, you have the opportunity to react to points that were mentioned by the other speakers.
You know what people say about Africa is about ancient continent. You know, the continent of the origin of the human race, the wise people who are always quiet and who have everything, but they are presented as the poorest who have nothing. You know, who are happiest and are made to look as those who are very sad. So Africans have developed an attitude of happiness as the measure of quality of life. You know, and then when you are internally happy, you may not have anything, but you are really content because you have people around, you have family. No, permit me really to say that the SDG agenda of the United Nations, and that's in reference to Lata, Narayanaswamy, people did not mention religion, but everything in the SDG agenda is Matthew chapter 25. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was in prison and you visited me. I was homeless and you sheltered me, and so on. These are the agenda of Jesus, for example, from a Christian point of view, in Matthew chapter 25, poverty eradication, hunger eradication, education, and so on and so forth. So the content, not who is delivering, not the messenger, but the message. The message of the SDGs is the message we preach in churches often every Sunday. It is the message preached in mosques. So whether the messenger is an atheist or a non-believer or whatever is a good point, but that's the issue, is that the content of the SDGs are religious content. And we from Africa, we see hunger, eradication, and poverty, and so on as part of the things religions are agitating for. So from this point of view, I do feel that the SDGs are very well placed in the content of global development, even though they are driven by the youngest in creation, the Eurocentric world. They need advice. Africa can give it to them if they ask. Otherwise, they run alone. And then when you finish running, you come back and start asking the questions you would have asked earlier. I do feel that this kind of conversation, which is triggered by the Berlin and the work you do, this kind of conversation is so key to global understanding. And the dialogues must continue, because only on the dialogues we can build peace. We need global peace. I hear people talk about post-COVID. I don't understand what that means. COVID has come to stay. When is it going to be post? COVID is not going tomorrow. The thing is staying on. And as we are talking, a country where I come from, Nigeria, 210 million people, I'm discussing now ethical dimensions, 210 million people, I'm looking at Timo of GIZ, 210 million people, once again, 1 million vaccines. 209 have no vaccine. And you have vaccinated yourselves 80%, 90% in one part of the world. So now transportation is open and COVID is finished. I mean, this is a big joke. So we must look at the world globally and not be petty, look at it from our own point of view and presume that everybody, once I wake up, everybody has woken up. When I go to sleep, everybody has gone to sleep. It's not like that. So religion and faith content beyond just the cover, beyond the form. Religion, the faith content is the ethical question of the things I've mentioned before, because it is the ethical, the practice, dealing with hunger, dealing with managing human beings, dealing with living in peace and allowing others peace, dealing with quality education, especially engaging in education of the teacher. You can't teach without being taught. So I want to thank you, Philip, for giving me this opportunity. But I do feel really that this conversation is useful, and I found the contributions of my co-speakers really very enlightening. I think we should continue this conversation.
Great, wonderful. And I'm also very happy that we still have some time to do so. Nadine, I would like to give you the opportunity to react to the statements made, and also this question implicitly posed or even explicitly posed by Obiora. You know, how can we decolonize and decenter our perspectives, our global discussions on development and the structures that this operates in?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ike. I think that, you know, this has sort of been coming through the week. And Dietrich, you also mentioned it. Lata, you also mentioned it. Prof. Ike, you also mentioned it. And I think, Timo, you also mentioned it. The danger as we develop networks and partnerships between global North and global South is that they may not be reciprocal. Well, in the past, they have not been reciprocal. Professor Ike, you made a very point, come to Africa, come and hear what we're doing, center your policies, your action on the actions that are happening in the global South, not only by recognized global development actors, as important as they are, and often they are funding you know, local initiatives on the ground. So I don't want to discount that or just say that they're working at this level and they do not touch grassroots, but developing reciprocity, power sharing of a real kind. I mean, that's a complex discussion in and of itself. Lata, you were asking whose power, whose influence. So in terms of decolonizing development, who's centered in this discussion? You know, we're holding the conference from Berlin, and it's wonderful to be hosted, I think. But who's the host in terms of some of these discussions, in terms of some of these engagements? So I think we should be developing networks and partnerships on an equitable basis. But in order to do that, we have to have a very sometimes critical but loving and just lens. Again, informed by the ethical content of our different religions, which all share, I think, some of those values. Thanks, Philip.
Thank you, Nadine. And I'd like to play the ball to Timo now. What's your take on this? How do we decenter development?
Thank you, Philip, for this easy question. To be honest, I really don't have an answer for this not easy to answer question. And I would be happy to learn from the other panelists how this functions. Please.
Great. Lata.
Right. So thank you. Again, so many wonderful contributions. My mind is sort of exploding and we have so little time left. So I did want to just draw out a couple of things because Nayla, you said some things that I just thought were really powerful about power, funnily enough. But one of the things in sort of thinking about knowledge and whose knowledge counts is I think there's also a value in thinking about how the dialogue between religion and development or SDGs and sort of powerful actors works, because I think it's good to acknowledge religious authorities or wherever they are as powerful political actors. So I know, like in the context of the UK, the Archbishop of Canterbury will come out with things, and there's always this slightly tepid kind of, there's a worry that you're seen as overtly politicized, as if you're not allowed to have a view. But of course, Obiora, you sort of talked about like the ways in which the SDGs are sort of implicitly expressing really fundamentally in lots of ways Christian things. And actually, if you could bring that partnership into the open, it would speak very much to Nayla, your point about we must be careful about endowing religious authorities with values that we don't then challenge. Because for me, in my head, I was listening to you, I was thinking, okay, so that seems to bring up the question of whose religious knowledge counts. I remember very open debates about the ways in which thinking about women. So if you go to the Commission on the Status of Women and the ways in which religion gets invoked by some conservative actors to defend really quite what lots of people, including other people of the same faith, in thinking about, say, statements that might promote gender equality, and religion gets invoked wrongly by many actors who say this is wrong, including, say, this was in the context of women's organizations. I think it was in the context of, say, Pakistan and Afghanistan, are saying you are misrepresenting our faith by invoking it to justify regressive measures and pulling out of gender equality statements. And that struck me because I thought, well, who has the power to interpret faith? Who has the power to sort of say what this or that religion means? And freedom of religion and belief must take account of who has the power to make that decision. So genuine freedom to use faith and spirituality as central to your own knowledge base and how we think about faith and the interaction with development must also take account of power. That feels to me really hugely important. And if we can actually bring religion and development really explicitly into that dialogue. So the other thing that occurs to me, and I'll stop at this point, but we must also, that's also an opportunity to confront the power structures that historically have existed. We think about coloniality, right? There's a coloniality linked with the expression of religion. We think about Christianity and missionaries. Let's confront that. Let's think about the ways in which that plays out in our world now, and how religious knowledge is conceptualized on the back of that very explicit power relation, because they have their own colonial artifacts, don't they? Particularly the Christianity, of course, most immediately and the most, but also other large faiths in Islam as well. So, and that was crowding out lots of sort of local, sort of, Nadine, to go back to your point, lots of local religious and spiritual ideas were crowded out by the entrance of the colonial of empires. So, and the Christianity in particular that it tended to bring. So I think there's something really exciting about thinking very carefully about power in religion and whose religious knowledge counts, and a freedom of religion and expression must start from that point, a really explicit commitment to say we really want a pluriversal approach to who gets to be religious and who gets to define religious ideas in service of our shared sort of goals, whether they're the SDGs or something else we're calling development or whatever. Thank you.
Thank you, Lata. And I would also like to open up the floor for questions from the audience. You're most welcome to either put a question in the chat, or I'm just seeing the chat is only available to co-hosts. Are we changing it now? Yes, we're changing it now. So the chat is available for questions. And you are also welcome to raise your hand, but I would, however, ask you to make your statements. Actually, don't make statements, please. Make very brief questions. I know there's lots of topics and lots of points that we can all relate to also in light of the discussions that we've had in the past days. But please do come in with very brief statements or questions. Very brief. I see Kolile.
Hello.
Thank you very much, Philip. My question really pertains to the role of local government in the discussions that we've just had. I'm raising that question particularly in recognition in terms of what the panelists were saying, particularly Lata, that we celebrate the idea that 190 countries came together, at least agreed on these goals that we must pursue. But often there is a disconnection between the states and where the rubber hits the road. At local government, we are the people who decide whether that tree must go and a community be built there. And the very same tree that we remove is the tree that people, for example, in Cape Town, drive miles to gather around it because they worship around a tree, not in buildings. Where the ones who control in terms of what must happen within the spatial kind of development. So that's my request, that if the conference could really pronounce itself primarily on the role of local government as a place where the rubber hits the road. And finally, I am a theologian for many years now. University of Western Cape allowed me an opportunity.
Please, short.
That's the last one. As a theologian, to reflect on these matters, but previously I could only do it in other disciplines. But then I'm reflecting on this as a theologian within a religion. So thank you very much, Philip, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity.
Thank you. I also have Janine. I will take a few questions, and then the panelists will have the opportunity to respond to the questions en bloc. Janine.
Good morning, everyone. Professor Lata, I actually want to speak to you about spirituality and development. I also do not have a theology background, and spirituality is one of my focus areas. And sometimes when you speak to people and you try to get their sense of spirituality and development within the SDG framework, they get a bit nervous. It's like they're not familiar or they're not easy discussing it. So my question to you is, and this is something that I've been grappling with, in terms of expanding spirituality and development, what is your take on using auto-ethnographic to expand spirituality and development? Because I want to include it, but my concern is, so how will this contribute to the knowledge production? Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. And there are two more hands, please. Short questions. Deidre and then Tom and Dege. Deidre. Okay, we'll take Tom first. Please unmute.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I really appreciate the conference and what the panelists have said.
Sorry, Philip, did you say my name? Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Philip, I'm very much pleasured now to be short, and it's very...
Deidre, please, let's hear Tom first. You were gone for a second there. Let's hear Tom first, and then you can come in.
I'm thankful of what the panelists have said. Now, when we talk of this global, this reaction of global on this pandemic of corona, you see, I think we should be serious, because our brother have really said something which has hit me very hard, that only 1 million vaccine and there are 200 million in a country. You see, that is not even a peanut. I think when we are talking on that, we as religious people, we should face the leaders to act on this, because many will continue to die, and there are some agents which can help us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And Deidre, please, short.
Yes, thank you, Philip. It's very difficult to be short for such a very important topic.
Yes, indeed.
But I will do my best. Thank you for Deidre and the panel. Yeah, hopefully we can continue this discussion on other platforms as well. So I wanted to bring a little bit of spanner to the well, I wouldn't really say spanner to the works, but there's another. I foresee another opportunity that each and every one of the speakers has brought out. Firstly, from the education perspective, we have, Cornerstone Institute is an institute that have already, started. It's a social justice institute, Christian values, explicit about Christian values, but follow a global ethos. In our curriculum, in our pedagogies, we follow a holistic approach, and we also follow transdisciplinary integration with modules that also with integration of people that is being disadvantaged from an educational perspective, but also from a financial perspective. And that is, ELP, extended learning programs, and recognition for prior learning. However, scholarship is a major problem. Oftentimes we have to send these students away. And I mean, that is a bit problematic, and hopefully this can be a conversation.
Deidre, I think you're
really
now you're back.
Bring in. Okay, sorry. Yes, sorry. Secondly, the stakeholders aspect, right? To bring religion and development within the equation, we're going to have a tremendous problem if we only look.
Deidre, it seems your connection is relatively weak. Perhaps you can phrase your question in the chat. And I would like to give the panelists an opportunity to answer some of the questions. I see, Nayla, you wanted to come in even at an earlier stage, so you have the first opportunity now. Please do feel free to react to any of the questions or to the panelists, other panelists' statements. I just want to mention the aspects that were mentioned now in the from the audience: the role of local government, the question of spirituality and development, autoethnography, vaccine equity, and the question of values, some of the issues mentioned, but of course you are also welcome to relate to the previous aspects that were mentioned. Nayla.
Thank you, Philip. I actually wanted to react to what Lata was saying because she ended on speaking about coloniality or empire, and how much of that we have in all our religions and world religions, and how much we need to be aware of that. And it was very interesting for me in Religions for Peace because in one of the documents and one of the key priorities of Religions for Peace being the environment, we were able through dialogue to say that all of us should be hearing traditional spiritualities that have no a tradition of empire, and especially not on earth, but respect Mother Earth, and that we should be able to listen to them. So all, I mean, our religions that are, we were talking mainly Christianity and Islam, that we tend to have an empire approach towards other religions, and to be able to hear traditional beliefs. And also, she had mentioned earlier, giving voice to people in religious interpretation that we haven't listened to before. And here I'm saying not only women, but people, vulnerable people, poor people, that them can tell you more about what God is, who God is, what God wants from us to be. So promoting those also theologies and creating fora so that not only one type of people get to have the legitimacy of speaking in the name of religion, but opening this up to believers and especially those who have not been heard of until now. Thank you.
Lata, I see your head nodding, and there were some questions that you might want to relate to, so please.
Thank you, Philip. I don't want to hog the floor here. I've had plenty of airtime, but thank you, Nayla. I just agree. Wow. Yes. Yes, please. Yes. More voices. That sounds excellent. But just to go back to the question about autoethnography, Janine, thank you for asking. Yes. Autoethnography, yes, please. I think the challenge in the development frame and practice that we work in is very often, just generally, there is a tendency to see qualitative research as, in a general sense, as not as valid, not as rigorous. I think my feeling is that there are very robust traditions of qualitative research that come out of feminist methodologies that do push back against that, and I don't think it's as bad as it was. But there's no question that, you know, things like randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. But to answer your question, I think autoethnography is really important. I think it can build bridges with people. I think I would say that autoethnography shouldn't be the limit of our ambition, right? It's very good in thinking about ourselves and our positionality and building those links, and particularly with spirituality. Can we relate to the people that we're trying to support and we work with? I think the question is, what do we do after that? And I think part of what we've talked about here today is very much about building those bridges. But I absolutely take your point. I think autoethnography is the really good starting point. You know, can we put ourselves into the frame? Not necessarily, so we're not just, you know, delivering a program or an intervention, or we're not just doing research, but we are implicated in the spaces that we work. And in that sense, it's really important, particularly when we're talking about spirituality, which is a relational idea, right? You don't experience spirituality in isolation, whether that's spirituality in relation to other people and how you feel about other people, or as we've discussed, you know, thinking about traveling long distances because we value a particular bit of nature or a tree. So spirituality is something that we share and it's expressed. So I think the role of autoethnography in that, absolutely, I think it's absolutely crucial. But I would also say I think it's probably the starting point. I don't think it's the limit of the ambition. It has to be putting ourselves in the space and then thinking creatively and critically about what do we do with that connection. Now that I've reflected on myself, what do I do now moving outwards? And I think that's really key. But thank you for raising it, because I think it's a really important point. But I'll turn the floor over. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you. And Timo, would you like to come in? I was wondering whether you could share your thoughts also on this question that we had earlier and that now came up in the discussion again. Do we need to include spirituality and religion in a possible post-2030 development agenda?
Thank you, Philip, for this question. There was a recent study of Face to Action pointing out that religious organizations owe 8% of the habitable land surface and 50% of schools worldwide. They account for 44% of all contributions to health services in Africa. So these are huge numbers. And if you leave these actors out in the formulation of a new post-2030 agenda, the new agenda will not fulfill its target. So for me, it's absolutely out of question that in the process of formulation, elaboration, and afterwards in the implementation, religious organizations and traditional beliefs are playing an eminent important role.
Yeah, thank you, Timo, for this important statement, and highlighting this important role also at an institutional level that religious communities play. Nadine, I see you are raising your hand, and please.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. I just wanted to respond to the one on COVID inequality. Of course, Professor Ike raised that issue. And I think here is sort of the prophetic role in the Christian tradition. We talk about the prophetic role of religious actors who have, of course, we've problematized the notion of power and also good religion and bad religion in terms of the way religious power and authority intersect. So of course, we know with bad religion in terms of religion and power, indigenous culture and then religion in Africa sometimes are a toxic mix in terms of gender issues like gender-based violence, for example. But I think in the case of COVID inequality, we need to be calling for religious leaders and faith actors. Lata, you talked about in the UK context, the Archbishop of Canterbury. In South Africa, we have a long tradition, of course, a double legacy in terms of colonialism and apartheid and the role that religion played there, but also the other legacy of liberative practice and involvement during the struggle era. And so in a so-called post-apartheid era, I'm not quite sure, we still carry much of that legacy. The call on religious leaders has been, in a South African context at least, to be prophetic in terms of addressing issues such as, vaccine inequality and even vaccine rollout, offering churches as places of vaccination. But of course, there's always the shadow side, where this week I was teaching clergy, and one of the clergy people said, he thinks that the vaccines are something that shouldn't be promoted by religious actors. And it was contested within the class context. But so there's this constant contestation, if you will, in terms of the power and authority of religious leadership. But certainly on a global scale, I think religious leaders can use the authority for the good in terms of highlighting these global inequalities.
Thank you, Nadine. Before I give the opportunity to Obiora, I want to give Caroline the opportunity to pose an additional question. So, Obiora, if you could bear with me for just 30 seconds. Caroline.
Thank you. I have a very concrete question. So thanks for the
Caroline, your audio is incomprehensible. Caroline,
the need for strengthening or multi-faith cooperations.
Caroline, your audio is incomprehensible. I will mute you as you seem not to be able to hear me either.
Now, can you hear me now?
Slightly better, but still. Perhaps you can pose your question in the chat, and I'll give Obiora the opportunity to come in first.
Is now better or not?
Slightly better. Yes. Caroline? Okay.
Yes, I try again. Sorry.
Caroline, please write your question in the chat and we'll have Obiora respond first.
I post it in the chat, okay?
Thank you.
Sorry about Caroline. I wish we had your question. Sorry, that's technology. Sometimes it happens. Philip and colleagues, there was one question from one of our friends concerning local government buy-in. And I thought that question is important. There's a language we often say, think globally, act locally. So, and often I use the example of Ghana. The Ghana government said, we want to plant trees, 5 million trees. Now, the religious leaders in Ghana and say, okay, we are going to plant 1 million trees. And there will be others buying into that. So we are talking about planting trees, greening the environment, eco-theology. So local governments are extensions of the central government. But beyond them, think about the civic space. Think about the public space. Think about the religious, the religious space. Think about the private space. And then, of course, governments and all the other coalitions, even individuals. So I do feel that the question whether local governments buy into it is not whether they should, they must. It's part of the agenda, but that's what a central government must sell. If you go to Geneva or to New York and sign a convention, you must also come home and make sure that it is practicable. It's difficult, of course, but that's the way to go. I look much more beyond government. Government is only a conjunction of our common will. We have transferred our will to those to manage our affairs, but we can't delegate and leave it there. We must also claim back and also control. So I think a coalition of government, of civil society, and of all the other actors, including religious actors, this is important to make sure that the 2030 agenda, and we're now thinking about after 2045 agenda, the Africa Union has already 2063 agenda. The African Union is already in year 2063, much, much ahead of the United Nations. Think about it. And they say the Africa we want. I'm sure other continents are doing the same. We need a projection and then we work towards it. It's not easy, but that's the way to go. Religious content, faith content, development content, SDGs, we can diversify them, but actually the whole world is united in looking for that which makes global peace. Each human being matters and no one should be left behind.
Thank you, Obiora. Staying with you for just a second, we have a question in the chat posted by Nas Swart. Listening to the very important points that have been made on religious freedom and equality between religions, does the Parliament of the World Religions Declaration toward a global ethic not represent an important normative framework? Don't know if you would like to react to that. Otherwise, we can move on to the next panelist. But I was wondering whether you might want to share your thoughts on the question posted.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
The answer is yes. The questioner has put a good point and the answer is just yes.
Great, thank you.
Point? Yes.
Thank you for the short answer. Very much appreciated. There's the opportunity for one or two brief questions, if anyone still has a brief question before we move to the last round. Now I see Caroline has posted her question. It's relatively long. My question concerns the need for inter and multi-faith cooperation. Where do you see the biggest gaps? At which level? Local, international, or maybe even better, trans-local? And connecting this issue with the power dynamics you discussed. WHO should fund these initiatives. How should it be funded? For example, strengthen existing big networks like Religions for Peace, a strategy that the German Federal Foreign Office is currently focusing on, or diversifying. Who should fund it? Yeah, and I think and it's not WHO. Okay, who is funding it and not WHO is funding it. Okay, sorry about that, Caroline. That I missed that because you used the capital letters. I interpreted it as WHO, but you are asking who is funding it and not WHO. Although WHO might actually contribute to the funding. In any case, I will now give the opportunity to the panelists for a last round of statements and to react to what has been said. And I would like to also hear a brief statement from each one of you. What is it that we need for a post-2030 agenda? And we'll start with Nadine.
Goodness gracious. What do we need for a post-30 agenda? I think we need to take into account the global inequalities that the agenda does talk about, but continue to interrogate the relationships of power, whether it is religious authority and power, or whether it is a global South dynamic. So for me, that's where I think we should start. I also think we should continue. Thank you, Nayla, also for the work you do and for the mention of the role of feminist theologies within our different traditions. I think we also need to be drawing on the strengths, the theological impetus and ethical impetus of our religious traditions in terms of social justice. Sometimes we focus on a charity relief dynamic, welfareist, if you will. I know that has many different meanings within different contexts, but certainly within the South African context, we want to push towards an agenda that takes social justice seriously, power dynamics seriously, and interrogates issues of authority and power, seeking to democratize perhaps is not the correct word, but certainly to even playing fields and to look at the ways in which frameworks like the SDGs recognize these issues in the way that they're articulated. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadine. And moving to the next panelist, Nayla.
Thank you, Philip. Do you have a question for me, or should I try answer?
Yes, you can answer any question that was posed, but my question to all of you is, what do we need for post-2030 development agenda?
Okay, thank
of
you.
course,
So
brief answer.
Okay,
Easy question, brief answer.
So I might also repeat a few things that I've said before, but also answer Caroline's question is the need to create spaces for working together interreligiously, but also between religious institutions and international bodies. We build on the work that was mentioned that Azza Karam started working on, and to build some reciprocal trust, actually, because in my part of the world, religious institutions feel that international bodies take on, or that, for example, European bodies or ministries of foreign affairs take the side of NGOs and not faith-based organizations because of the values, again, the values of public life part where they are. So how can we, work around this and build the trust, work with religious institutions, but not also seem as if we are accepting some of their some of the interpretations that don't match with the values of international organizations. But the way we work is always creating fora for discussion, fora for hearing different voices, and for saying that we want to work together, but let's find at least like a common ground for values that we are working on. And from the part of religious institutions and religious leaders, make them also believe that they are doing the change. This is our experience in Adyan. Currently, we are working also with the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs on upgrading or working with religious leaders to reform personal status laws. And here again, we're talking about SDG 5, because personal status laws are discriminatory to women. And in Lebanon, we have the 15 religious personal status laws, Christian and Muslim. So working with religious leaders from within, so that they feel we're not coming from above and telling them this is how it should be, but how can we work in the reform of the laws from within? Sorry, I took long.
Thank you, Nayla, for highlighting the importance of common ground of values and interreligious dialogue. Timo, moving towards post-2030, what do we need?
What do we need? Thank you for your last question, Philip. In my understanding, or in my perception, the understanding of the concept of sustainability increased over the last years and found its way in all our societies. Even my parents are now speaking about sustainability, and you only have to look at the younger generation engaging themselves for Fridays for Future. So the concept of sustainability is understood within all our societies. At the same time, the necessity of taking sustainability seriously is growing. Just look at the climate change debate. So the old question remains valid. What does it mean to lead a morally good life? This question was answered by all the religions for a long period of time. And if you look at the duration or validity period of answers of religions, they answer this question quite successful. But for the future, and for contributing more actively in saving our planet, religions must also find the answer to the question, what does it mean to lead a sustainable life? And here comes in my personal wish that religious actors should offer this orientation in a meaningful, sensible way. And my fear is that the answer of fasting or another story of waiver is not falling on a fruitful ground in all the societies. So we need a new virtue of the right measure, solidarity with the poorest, charity. And there all the religions are playing a very, very important role, more important than local governments or national governments. Thank you.
Thank you, Timo. And moving to Obiora, post-2030, what do we need?
Great pleasure, great pleasure. And I do feel that we started in year 2000 with MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, till 2015. In 2015, the world moved to Sustainable Development Goals till 2030. I would wish that from 2030 for another 15 years, we should think about Sustainable Integral Development Goals. The integral brings in everything, including the spiritual, the religious, and so on, because development is a dry word, and it is development in one role, material development. But sustainable integral development goals brings in what Timo and what my colleagues have tried to say, that adds the human quality. And that human quality is comprehensive. It brings in values, it brings in ethics, it brings in happiness, it moves beyond GDPs, which Dietrich Werner tried to say. So I will think that one world is the focus, but sustainable integral development goals 2030 to 2045 keys in the entire scope of what we are looking at. And we shall be alive then to measure it.
Thank you, Obiora. And Lata, you have the last word on the panel. And I see you already posted the last word in the chat, but please do elaborate on it.
Well, thank you. Wow, that's a very unique privilege. Thank you very much, everyone, for the rich discussion. Oh, as ever, so much to say and never enough time. But I think just to build on what everyone has been saying, but of course, my fantastic panelists from whom I've learned quite a lot today, which has been wonderful. For me, I have two things I'd want to add. The first is, I think for us to move forward, we need a much more open dialogue about the past. I do feel that we are never going to get to anything like sustainable development if we're not honest about the way the world looks now and why it looks as it does. I think we're in the midst of a really difficult period in thinking about Black Lives Matter, anti-racism, and a real reluctance to own the fact that European empire is quite a lot of the reason why the world looks as it does. Now, that can't just be looking back because there's no point in the hand-wringing, it's done. What we have now is a shared responsibility to work out what we do about that. And part of that has to be starting where people are. And spirituality and religion is a core part of that. We can't discount that as some separate sphere that people interact with and exist separate to some notion of sustainability. People exist in contradictory ways within themselves. And where we start to build ideas of sustainability has to start where people are. The other key hope I would have for a post-2013 agenda would be that we focus on process, not outcome. We are never going to get to a point where we get to 2030 or 2045 and we've solved everything. That's not how life works. We need to think about structures and processes. We need to be thinking about how power relations, which draw their power from those historical associations, to sort of think about structurally how we move forward, because this is going to be continuous. We're never going to get to a point where we can stop, think, oh, phew, okay, we've done sustainable development. Now what are we going to do next? That's never going to be an option. Process, a focus on process will give us an opportunity to think about relationality. What sorts of structures do we put in place to then think about the kind of world that we are all going to live in? How do we share that world? What does sustainability then look like in a world that is shared amongst us? And I think if we can think about process, that sort of question. So Janine, your point about sort of certain types of evidence and you know, ethnography, we can have those debates. Who is in that space? Whose voices count in those discussions? But that's a continuous process. We're never going to get to a point where we've sort of finished this. It's a journey, and it's a continuous one. And spirituality, religion, those sorts of voices that have been suppressed, how we think about power, absolutely central to that. I'd like the SDGs moving after 2030 to be about process. How do we live together? That for me would be a real focus and a real victory if we can get to that point. Thank you.